So the last series of videos talked about persuasion, specifically persuasive theory with rhetorical proofs and expanding on the rhetorical situation. We're now going to switch gears into methodology, so how to start creating the persuasive speech. So this video is going to address topic selection and very briefly touch on methods of organization. So how to pick your topics, and then later on how to organize them. So we'll start first with topics. Now keep in mind, for the informative speech we started with a subject, right, which is a very broad area of information. But in order to get an actual speech, you need to narrow down to a topic, which is a full sentence really saying what your speech is going to cover. In some ways it's also kind of your thesis statement. In a persuasive speech, you're also going to start with a subject, but when you narrow down to a topic, you have to figure out which option you want to choose. And the options are question of fact, question of value, and question of policy. Now, right now, these terms are going to mean absolutely nothing to you, so don't worry. But essentially what these questions break down to is your goal as a speaker. What is it that you want your audience to do? Do you want them to change their belief? Do you want them to change their attitude? Or do you want them to change their behavior? So let's talk about them. So question of fact, question of value, and question of policy all break down to either changing the audience's attitudes, values, beliefs, or behavior. Question of fact. What you're dealing with here is you want your audience to believe something or change what they believe. And by this, we're talking about things like historical controversies, questions of current existence, or predictions. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. Question of value is not getting the audience to believe something, but rather to change their attitude on something. So typically we're weighing moral options. So things are better or worse, moral or immoral, right or wrong. And I'll give you an example of this in a second. Question of policy is not asking for the audience to believe something or to change their attitude on something, but rather they need to change their behavior. So for here, you're asking that some action should be taken place or maybe should not take place. So you need to answer the questions of who will be taking on this action and what the actual action is. So let's look at examples. For question of fact, remember this is getting the audience to believe something. So for instance, to persuade my audience that ghosts are real, you're getting them to believe in that existence. To persuade my audience that the Spurs will win the NBA Finals, so this is a prediction that something will happen. To persuade my audience that the government is covering up Area 51, so conspiracy theories are very common for this kind of topic. To persuade my audience that Oswald acted alone when assassinating President Kennedy, so this of course would be a historical controversy. But again, the goal here is to get your audience to believe in the existence of something. Now, question of value is getting your audience to change their attitude on something. To persuade my audience that human cloning is morally justified. To persuade my audience that chemical weapons are immoral. To persuade my audience that it is better to live together before marriage. To persuade my audience that Pepsi is better than Coke. So here you'll notice on the topics the emphasis is morally justified, immoral, better, better. Now the last one, question of policy, is a little bit more complicated than the other two. The topics have to be written in this way. To persuade my audience. Now that actually goes for any persuasive topic. Question of fact, question of policy will always have to persuade my audience. It's the second part that's important to pay attention to here. X should do Y. So when we talk about that, X is the institution making the change, aka who, right? Who's actually going to be doing this, and Y is the change, the what. Now the reason this is important is because the institution actually breaks down to two different options that you have in question of policy. So for institution, you could have two things. One, you could have an entity, and two, you could have an audience. An entity is going to be really anything that's not the audience. So the U.S. government, Palm Beach State College, the city of Lake Worth, anything like that. So let's talk about these two options. If you have an entity making a change, we call that passive agreement. So this is someone other than the audience that is taking a change of behavior. We consider that passive because the audience is actually just agreeing or disagreeing. They're not actually doing something actively. Some examples of this are Congress should authorize drone strikes on ISIS, colleges should decrease tuition prices by 5%, and Florida should allow medicinal cannabis. All of these, you'll notice, have an institution, right? Congress, colleges, Florida. The audience couldn't actually do any of these things. They don't have the power to decrease tuition. They don't have the power to authorize drone strikes. Now, let's say you did have the audience doing something. That would be personal action. So personal action is when the audience has to make the change. They have to get up and go do something, like say running. So some topic examples: to persuade my audience to participate in intramural athletics, to persuade my audience to volunteer as literacy tutors, to persuade my audience to vote in the next election. Notice for all of these, volunteering, participating, voting, the audience would have to do it, right? An institution could not take on this action. They don't have that ability. So when we're thinking about topics, you have to first start with a subject area. I'll give you the example here of dogs. Now remember, when we're narrowing in on a topic, you then have to pick from these options: question of fact, question of value, question of policy, passive, and question of policy, passive, personal. All of these could fit this topic. It's really up to you to pick. So if I did question of fact, I could do dogs descend from wolves. I'm just getting the audience to really change their belief on this, believe this statement. Question of value, I'm going to get them to change their attitude on dogs, so dogs are better than cats. Question of policy, passive, I want an institution to make a change, so I could say Palm Beach State should allow dogs on campus. And question of policy, personal, is me asking the audience to do something behaviorally, so I could say everyone should adopt a dog. So these are all ways in which you can take the subject area and make it a topic. So let's play a game, guess the topic. See if you can figure out what the topic actually would fit into as far as questions. So it is better to sign a prenuptial agreement before marriage. Question of value, so hopefully you guessed that one. Palm Beach State should increase funding for clubs. See if you can guess what that one is. So hopefully you guessed passive, right? Because it's Palm Beach State that's taking on this change. The audience couldn't do it. And remember, passive is question of policy. I'm just using the shorthand passive here. All students should recycle on a daily basis. So take a second to figure out what that is. This one is personal. The audience would have to make the change. The U.S. should legalize marijuana. So that is passive. Hopefully you got that one. Again, because the U.S. government would have to do it. The death penalty is morally wrong. So this is value, right? Because we're actually changing our attitude towards the death penalty. We are in fact not changing the death penalty itself. And then the last one, everyone should make a Facebook page. So this one is personal. Notice here I didn't have any examples of question of fact. I typically find question of fact only make up about 5% of the overall topics I see. Question of policy is the most common one, which is why a majority of the examples here are question of value, or question of policy, excuse me. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind, there will be banned topics, topics you cannot do for this speech. They are abortion. No one's going to change their mind on it. There's no point in talking about it. Legalization of marijuana. I'm sorry, guys, that pot is not legal, but I do not want to hear your speech on it. Lowering the drinking age. Yes, I know Europe has it, but get over it. And by the way, it's Reagan's fault that we have 21. In case you're interested in that history, look it up. It's Reagan's fault. Same-sex marriage, at this point it's almost a null, issue, but yeah, you can't do it. Texting while driving, we all know we shouldn't do it, but people do it anyways, unfortunately. Anything health related, I'm going to kind of put an asterisk by that one. Health topics typically don't do that well because most of the time we already know we should, be healthy and do things like that. So those I'm going to caution you on, and blood donation, that's a banned topic. So none of these topics can be done. Do not even try submitting them to me. One thing too, as a topic requirement, so all the topics, all the requirements that I had for the informative speech, as far as it being researchable, it being narrowed, it being relevant, it being new, those are all still requirements, but I'm going to be adding on an additional requirement specifically for the persuasive speech, and that is that it's controversial. For persuasion, you're convincing your audience, and if it's not something they disagree with, or at least a portion of your audience doesn't disagree with, there's no point in talking about it, right? So if you wanted to do a speech on adopting a dog, most people agree with this, right? They may not be able to adopt a dog themselves, but they're going to agree in essence with the value of that choice. So if no one disagrees with this, what's the point of talking about it? Same thing with bullying, right? I have a lot of students who want to do a speech on bullying. Most people agree that bullying is wrong, right? And you're not going to convince a bully in a 5-minute speech that all of a sudden they should change their life. So again, if anyone doesn't agree with that or no one disagrees with that, there's no point in actually doing it. So it has to be something that's controversial. You have to know that at least a portion of your audience disagrees with this. And last but not least, homework. So what I need you to do, 1, come up with 4 example topics. So keep in mind you have question of fact and question of value, so I need 1 for each of those. Now the reason there's 4 is because there's 2 options for question of policy. There's question of policy personal and question of policy passive. Next, I need you to come up with 3 full sentence controversial topics. So you might be asking, well, why is she asking us to come up with more topics if we just had to come up with 4 topics? These are going to be topics that you actually want to do. So I need you to identify what question you're going to put them in. So for an example, you would say, to persuade my audience to donate blood, which is a banned topic, and then you would say that goes into question of policy, personal action. So for number 2, all of your topics could say be personal action topics. That's perfectly fine. For question 1, I'm really just trying to make sure you understand how each of those works, right? That you understand how to create a question of fact topic, a question of value topic, question of policy personal, and question of policy passive. For number 2, what I'm looking for you to do is come up with 3 topics that you actually want to do for the speech. This is what I'm going to utilize to actually approve topics. So what you have to do is put down the topic and identify what question it falls into. So like I said, these should be ones you want to do for the speech. Once you've done that, you need to tell me what's the difference between passive and personal. It's important you understand the difference. And then what's required of a persuasive topic. So there's one requirement that I added on that I just talked about a second ago, in addition to what's already required for a topic that, for instance, is informative when we talked about it being narrowed and relevant and all that sort of stuff. So that's it.